You sit here.
I time generally quite well.
Yeah.
Time generally.
Am I now connected? Can people hear me? Hello. Good afternoon. We are going for our last session of today, the most interesting one. The last session is always the most interesting one. And it is about the challenges of market integration. I'm Alon Baum, the ambassador of Israel here in Rome. And when we talk about the challenges of market integration, we are talking about the need in the East Mediterranean context on the requirement infrastructure, the importance of interconnection and connectivity grids and well-implemented regulations, but also the need for cooperative security framework in order to create the kind of stability that can attract companies to work in this market. And the question how market actors are interacting among themselves with government, intergovernmental organization in order to create that energy security space is the topic of this discussion. And we have three marvelous panelists to discuss this. The first will be Dr. Ahmed Evin. He's a founding dean in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science and the professor emeritus in the Sabanci, right? I pronounce it right? In the Sabanci University in Istanbul. You will be the first. So please take the floor and let all try to focus on the time frame that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And special thanks to the NATO Defense College Foundation, and particularly to Ambassador Minuto Rizzo for having me back in Rome, which is always a memorable experience, both the gathering here and being in the city. Given the time constraint, let me start right away with the Mediterranean North and South, which has been connected by gas pipelines bringing North African gas to Europe. But because of the current crisis, the energy resources in the Maghreb became once more the source of attention, as you heard in the last two sessions. Last January, Prime Minister Meloni visited Algeria to sign a deal for additional 9 BCM of gas annually. Similarly, Eni's chief executive, Mr. Dekatsi, has called for a new south-north axis. Moreover, the idea of a trans-Saharan pipeline, first proposed in the 70s, has been revived with the planned Trans-African gas pipeline, or NIGAL, that I can see there, which will carry up to 30 BCM of gas from Nigeria to Algeria that could then be exported to Europe. These are some of the major projects and ideas cooking up. Now, with respect to the NIGAL pipeline, how that might affect the regional markets is another question that I do not have time to delve into, but it is an important question. Europe's search for new energy resources is not confined to fossil fuels. Another thing that we have heard, solar energy potential of the Sahara and North Africa in general has attracted attention, particularly of German industry, but for a variety of reasons, the Desertec project has been discontinued. It was abandoned in 2015. In the wake of this energy crisis that we're experiencing now, there has been a revival of interest in North Africa's solar energy potential, and in further connections across the Mediterranean, as Ambassador Ferrara mentioned. The proposed X-Links Morocco-UK power project is designed to have 3.6 gigawatt high voltage interconnector to transmit solar and wind generated power from Morocco to the UK. But it hasn't attracted all the funding, but if built, it will be able to provide 7.5% of the UK's electricity demand. It's a huge project. Spain is planning another connection to add 700 megawatt capacity to its existing undersea connection to Morocco. As for the erstwhile German solar ambitions, the new idea that has the EU support is to produce green hydrogen, as Ambassador Ferrara also mentioned, with solar power and then export it to Europe via pipelines. The challenge we're facing in Europe is not merely how to fill the gap left by the absence of Russian gas, but more significantly, I'd say, how to address the immediate short-term challenges while keeping a steady course toward energy transition, even if we experience some reversals on the way. Turning to the Eastern Mediterranean, where market integration remains a serious challenge, if not a distant goal. As the discovery of gas in the region in 2009-2010, as mentioned earlier, led to great expectations, but hopes for becoming a prosperous energy provider to the European market turned out to be difficult to achieve. For a number of reasons, I can give a lot of them, but rising demand in the region is one. Small volumes of gas deposits in Cyprus, their monetization being difficult is another one. But above all, maritime delimitation disputes between Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and eventually the EU that stand in the way of pipeline connections. The disagreements in question seem to be insurmountable. Turkey and Greece having made no progress in 62 rounds of exploratory talks between them over the past 2 decades. Further complicating factors have arisen since the Aegean coastal waters issue flared up in the 1990s. With respect to maritime claims, Greece and Turkey stand far apart. Well, you see how far apart they are in claims. That's a very interesting and graphic representation that was published in the Washington Post not long ago. Further complicating factors have arisen. As I said, with respect to maritime claims, Greece and Turkey still stand far apart. Turkey is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and prefers to conduct bilateral negotiations with Greece, whereas Greece prefers to have international mediation, which Ankara does not trust. Cyprus poses further challenges. On one hand, Turkey does not recognize the Republic of Cyprus's sovereignty over the entire island, given that Ankara views the Nicosia government as representing the Greek community only, but not.
We do have to accelerate a little bit, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. But not representing the island's Turkish community. On the other hand, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is not recognized internationally to be a legitimate negotiating party. So there we stand, the situation that remains a textbook case for stalemate. Under the circumstances, a very large chunk of the Eastern Mediterranean, not only, and not to speak of the Aegean, fall in the category of disputed waters. The Mediterranean Gas Forum, as mentioned, which gained the status of an international organization in March 2021, marked a further split in the region between Turkey on the one hand and members of the forum on the other, not to speak of the observers. Given the increasing difficulties of building underwater infrastructure for the transport of gas, the costs and uncertainties involved, and especially the EU commitment to transition away from fossil fuels, it appeared that the building of EastMed pipeline would not be a wise investment. The EastMed gas thus came to be considered in terms of the region's own market, with the possibility of exporting some of the LNG via Egypt's liquefaction plants. However, let me point to a very recent study last week by the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, which has refocused attention to the importance of Eastern Mediterranean as a promising new energy source for Europe. And there, as you see, a calculation is made of how the cost of carrying gas via different routes to Europe from Eastern Mediterranean. It can be done economically. That looks doable. But I return to the key question of how much gas will Europe need by the time the EastMed gas pipeline is built, if at all. Finally, finishing up, ongoing EastMed project is relevant for market integration as it is for energy transition. The Euro-Asian interconnector joining the Greek, Cypriot, and Israeli power grids via the world's longest undersea power cable that connects Asia to Europe. It is calculated by ENSO to make a major contribution, around $1 billion annually, for welfare in the region. So to sum up, let me return to 3 points that I made in respect to what stands in the way of market integration and how it could be achieved. One is that the integration of EastMed energy markets has to begin, with a solution to the Cyprus problem. Does that sound like a non-starter? But it has to. That would be an essential first step towards the process of Turkey's reintegration into the Euromed structures, provided that Turkey itself becomes an active and willing partner. I realize that this is a challenging proposition. Number two, the EastMed gas has far more important potential than being merely an export commodity. It can meet rising regional demand, support coal-to-gas switching in the region in the near term, and increasingly can be used for hydrogen production. Finally, as President von der Leyen has emphasized, any new pipeline ought to be designed for carrying hydrogen, thus support energy transition goals. So it seems that market integration, given the challenges in the future, also will have to take into consideration the essential new fuel, because green energy, wind, solar, does not produce fuel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Avin. And our next speaker is Dr. Rim Berahab. Dr. Berahab is a senior economist in the Policy Center for New South in Rabat. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. I'm very delighted. So for my part, I would like to focus a little bit more on South-South integration in the energy sector, mainly from an economic perspective and the needs for it, and solely focusing on North Africa since it's the area that I cover mostly. Now, starting with some economic theory, from an economic perspective, the divisions between countries created by geographical locations, poor infrastructure and inefficient policies may be an impediment to economic growth. So as a response, regional integration, always from a theoretical perspective, allows countries to overcome these challenges and these costly divisions by integrating goods and services and people. Now, regional integration can be fostered both through physical and institutional infrastructure. Specifically, it requires countries to cooperate around the trade agreements, investment and domestic regulations, but also the transportation and energy infrastructure and some macroeconomic and financial policies. Now, as Mediterranean countries or North African countries seek a way forward in the wake of the multiple crises that have disrupted their economies in the past years, accelerating regional integration is more important than ever. And while there are multiple entry points for achieving this agenda, few are more important as energy. Now, despite this, when we look at the region of North Africa, we see that it is among the least integrated regions in the world, combined with sub-Saharan Africa as well. So currently, intra-Mediterranean trade, for instance, is valued at less than $1 trillion annually. So barely a third of the trade between the Med countries and the rest of the world. And this contrasts with other prosperous regions where their largest trading partners are usually their neighbors. And within this limited framework, energy currently accounts for only about 1/3 of regional trade. So several factors currently impede regional integration in the energy sector in the North Africa, and my fellow speaker has talked about it, and I will just briefly highlight some of them. So first of all, countries might have different priorities for regional integration, and it is also very difficult to assess the impacts of this regional integration on trade, investment, growth, or income distributions. Another issue is the lack of appropriate policies and regulation and also institution which can lead to inefficient outcomes. And last but not least, regional integration creates winners and losers, particularly within countries. Now, despite these obstacles, harnessing the potential for further economic integration between countries of North Africa could be an energy game changer. So we talked about it earlier. Fossil fuels are still the main source of energy produced in this region, but there is also a rise in renewable energy. And we cannot look at South-South cooperation in the region without also looking at some external factors that influence energy policy within this region. And here I am referring to Europe's increased needs for oil and gas in the short term, but also renewables and hydrogen in the long term. Even though this poses the issue of trade-offs among North African countries between contributing to Europe's current energy need and also responding to their own domestic needs, which we mentioned earlier. This region is witnessing a tremendous growth of population and increased need for energy. Now, going into more specific countries, so Algeria has indicated its willingness to increase and ability to increase gas supply to Europe, and Egypt is also making progress in positioning itself as a key regional player in terms of processing and re-export of gas. And I would like to focus a moment on the case of the East Med Gas Forum, and we talked extensively about it earlier, but it is because it's a good case study for this. So basically, the main challenge is to identify markets where natural gas can be competitive. And as such, investment in exploration and development will not happen unless the competitiveness of known resources are proven. So therefore, regional integration could be the key to unlocking the value of the gas in the region with the aim of reducing costs and risk and attracting investors and so forth. However, from an economic perspective, there are some elements or some challenges that need to be overcome in order to achieve this. So first, and the main one, is to open the gas market to competitive trade, and also to harmonize pricing regimes and remove some trade barriers. And here I'm referring to the very sensitive issue of energy subsidies, which is not a very easy task to do. Another element is the establishment of enabling infrastructure or fiscal framework to reduce the costs of gas supply to regional and international markets, as well as to enable the use of common infrastructure. But we are very far from achieving these elements. On the renewable energy front, some projects are being developed in North Africa, for example, in Egypt and Morocco with solar and wind, but also the development of green hydrogen. But this effort seems to be country-led, and there is no concrete regional South-South cooperation in this sense, except from some bilateral partnerships, for instance, like between Morocco and Israel. And there's also an emerging competition within these countries, especially in terms of clean hydrogen development and export markets, so namely the EU. But despite that, there are still so many technical, economic, and financial challenges to the development of green hydrogen. One of them is that it is still very costly compared to other sources of energy. Now, to conclude, ultimately, realizing the many benefits of regional cooperation in energy depends on the political will, on regional trade agreements, and the adoption of market-based energy prices throughout the region. It also depends on the development of shared infrastructure, so namely pipelines and power grids that could facilitate the deployment of energy. Another thing is that harmonizing regulations and policies could also help create a more cohesive energy market, since it is currently characterized by a patchwork of policies. Another element is the sharing of technology and expertise among countries in the region. And last but not least, ensuring a fair distribution of benefits could help mitigate some of the risks or the perceived risk that energy integration could create winners and losers. But as I said earlier, it is easier said than done, and where the region is still faced with tremendous challenges, and I'll stop here for now.
Well, you met the challenge of the time frame significantly. So thank you very much for that. Leonardo Bellodi, our final speaker, is an adjunct professor at the Lewis Business School in Rome, and a very knowledgeable person about the issue of energy and especially the geopolitics in energy. So please.
Thank you so much. Since I don't have really the deep academic knowledge of my previous speakers, I will start with a couple of anecdotes. I would thank you, Ambassador Mutualisto, for inviting me. Speaking about him, I remember that in September last year, I broadcast a TV interview on, I don't remember which channel, and the day after, he called me. And I was expecting, that he was telling me how amazing was my interview. Far from that. He called me to tell me off. And he told me off because I was really pessimistic about the energy landscape. And why I was so pessimistic? Well, he told me off because he said, you shouldn't scare people like that. From time to time, we shouldn't tell the truth, the complete truth. And why I was so pessimistic? Because it was well before the warm winter, very warm winter we had. But if we hadn't such a warm winter, what could happen? And in my position, my thought, wrongly or rightly, I don't know, is what we couldn't get rid of the Russian gas. Without Russian gas, we couldn't have really, we had huge problems in Europe. And even for the next winter, despite all the huge effort carried out by, in primis, Eni, well, I think that without Russian gas, we would be really in trouble if we will have very cold winter. So, Ambassador Mitrovica was right, but only because he was lucky and we had a very, very warm winter, you know. And the second anecdote is relating to the East Med. A few days ago, I had a meeting in Washington with Amos Hochstein. Amos Hochstein is now back to as a civil servant. He's a special envoy for energy under the Biden administration. But he used to be special envoy for energy even under the Obama administration. And speaking about phone calls, we remember when a few years ago, when I used to work at ENI, he called me one day and said, listen, you are working on a specific project in Lebanon at the border with Israel. Well, forget about it. Don't even think about it. Because, you know, it's so critical the situation among the two countries. Now it's a bit settled, but at the time was really a problem, a sensitive problem. So he suggested me, as only the US can do, he suggested me to drop the project, waiting for some kind of mediation carried out by US between Israel and Lebanon. Why we are speaking about Amos Hochstein and the geopolitical problems in the region? Because a lot has been fixed. A lot has been fixed. Israel, Lebanon has settled more or less the borders and so on. But we have other geopolitical problems. I will not make reference to the geopolitical problem concerning Cyprus, because you have already spoken about it. But what about, for example, the agreement, which a lot of people think that is in violation of the basic principle of international law between Libya, between Tripoli and Ankara? So basically, such an agreement split it into two parts, the Mediterranean, in the vertical way. So it will be very difficult to lay any kind of pipeline, because of course, the difference between the European Union and Ankara, between Brussels and Ankara, is that Brussels sends diplomatic notes. Ankara sends warships. So of course, it's not difficult to guess who will win, between a fight, between a warship and a diplomatic note. So we should take into consideration that despite of the economic challenges, East Med is a big economic challenge. Is sustainable at the last year price? Yes. But will the gas prices will be the same? Well, it's hard to tell. You may perhaps some ideas about it, but gas prices are dropping, as likely we are seeing now. So, despite the economic challenges, which are huge, we still have geopolitical ones. We have, for example, the Cyprus, and we have the not negligible problem of the agreement between Ankara and Tripoli. Because, they are enforcing it. So how can we deal with it? It's difficult, even because, we want to have good relationship as Europe and as Italy with Ankara, which is becoming a transit hub, very, very important. With Libya, for many reasons, not only for energy, because as Italian, other countries can, let's say, go to restaurants of the international relation restaurants and make a choice a la carte. Well, we have a fixed menu. Our first priority has to be and should be Libya, for the very simple reason that it's so close to us, that we don't have any choice in international relations. Our first priority has to be, of course, Libya. So basically, we need to have good relationship with Libya. So we cannot just say, it's illegal from international point of view. It is. Everybody thinks it is. But we cannot really, have a wall-to-wall situation with Tripoli or Benghazi or wherever the Libyan government is. You know much better than I do. And so that's, and I finish. That's the challenges we face. That they're not easy, not easy at all. We cannot get rid of Russian gas for the next future. East Med is really a challenge. And of course, we can bring a lot of gas from other countries, but we have to face that even other countries are, countries in which you have political struggles. And we should be very, very careful in order to don't, to have other countries to have a huge leverage on Europe. Because we will have the same situation with Russia. I finish.
Thank you very much for the three panelists, and I think you highlighted each one of you from a different perspective, but at the end of the day, the challenges and the difficulty in creating and overcoming some of the efforts to create that integration of market in the Mediterranean in general, and especially the possibility of connecting the East Mediterranean potential for European consumption. Before we leave this option altogether, I want to raise a few questions related that some of them you referred to. First of all, as we know, pipelines are not the only way to get to use the energy resources of the East Mediterranean, while the capacity may be reduced and, as you said, cannot be fully replaced. The Russian as diversifying, which is one of the Italian objective and European objective, diversifying the sources of energy, it could be an important, to what extent the LNG solution, if you will, can be a significant replacement for the East Mediterranean pipeline. But the other thing is, I think, is we didn't deal enough with the question of how commercial companies can in some place either replace or promote enough incentives to replace or to overcome geopolitical challenges. I had the privilege, Noam Mosechstone very well, because I was part of the negotiating team on the Israeli-Lebanese maritime border agreement. And the basic agreement there is, Lebanon does not recognize Israel. It's not a political agreement. It's basically an agreement for companies like any to be able to exploit the potential of gas without necessarily somehow trying to bypass the need to reach an agreement. There was a need for some kind of framework agreement, and then, so my question is, to what extent do we have a potential for companies to somehow overcome some of the difficulty, or is it a dead end without the possibility to solve it? And my last question is this. Pipelines in general and energy projects in general and pipeline in particular are time consuming. All of us ask ourselves when it is finished, how much the demand will be, what will be the options, etc. And they're very expensive. That requires some level of reliability and confidence between the countries. The East Mediterranean potential does offer a certain level, Cyprus, Greece, Israel, certain level of, I think, reliability. Is that an important factor, or is that we learned from what happened in the last few years with China, Russia, and others, or is that something that does not impact the challenges that you already mentioned? So, short reference. I will start with your permission on the other way around, please, if you can start.
Thank you. About the role of the commercial companies, you might recall that a few years ago, the European Commission has launched a project so-called Nabucco. And it made no economic sense. And commercial companies weren't really interested into it. It then never happened. It never happened. So of course, geopolitics and politics play a major role in shaping the energy landscape, that's for sure. But on the other side, if the companies, the commercial companies are not interested, it's not going to happen, as simple as that. And Nabucco teaches us, because they drop it. They drop it for a very simple reason that only politics were behind it, and not Eni, not Total, not Exxon, and so on and so on. So at the end of the day, even if from a political point of view, was a significant and very important project in order to get rid of the Russian gas. Well, the European Commission at the end of the day, he had to surrender, said, okay, we will not go ahead with it. So, of course, the public and private sectors should work together. Because, a lot of times I heard that huge, important energy companies are making, are doing politics and they are shaping the international relations. I don't agree. One thing is the government and the other thing is the commercial company. Interests could overlap, of course. They could help each other, but they pursue different interests, and rightly so. So of course they have to work together, and but each entity has to play its own role. Of course, we are speaking about Mediterranean, we are speaking enjeux politique from very, very important. So of course, states have to agree, have to settle, but again, the commercial companies have to do their own job.
Thank you for that. Victoria.
Thank you for your question. So I will perhaps pick up on one of the points that you mentioned and adopt a different approach and focus mostly on the West Med and Sub-Saharan Africa, since it's the region that I cover. And this region is faced with different challenges than that of East Med. And I will adopt a point of view from developing countries. So we've seen recently, with the war by Russia and the energy crisis in Europe, that these countries are called upon to contribute to Europe's energy security. We've seen Europe go into Algeria, Egypt, but also having discussions with several sub-Saharan African countries like Nigeria, Mozambique, and Tanzania to either increase supply of natural gas or create new projects. However, the question that many experts ask is, are these countries able to fulfill this role, knowing that they are faced with their own energy security challenges, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of access, infrastructure, etc.? And even though this renewed interest of Europe may come with some benefits in terms of increased additional export revenues, many of the countries that are already exporting to Europe are doing so at full capacity. So how can they further increase this capacity? And when we look at the case of sub-Saharan Africa, we notice that in recent years, international oil companies have been reducing investment in upstream hydrocarbon projects. And now that Europe is looking for more oil and gas in the short term, because it has both short-term strategy of oil and gas and long-term strategy of decarbonization, many developing countries have called or asked if this isn't a double standard, because oil and gas projects are a very capital-intensive one with long payback periods. So these countries have to be very careful at their projections of their energy policies, because if investors will invest in an oil and gas plant, it has to be sure that by the time the gas comes comes into market, the demand will be there for many years, which is not guaranteed since Europe is also trying to decarbonize with the EU Green Deal, the Repower EU strategy. So this poses the risks of stranded assets in these countries at a time where the world is advancing towards decarbonization.
It does require some level of gambling.
Yes, or trade-offs between, short-term priorities and long-term considerations, and it is upon each country to decide the amount of this trade-off.
Man's hope for future development of markets is the essence of capitalism. Without it, it would never work. Maybe they're wrong. Please.
Well, I mean, market integration is essentially bringing together sovereign states and companies located there in some common interest, and that common interest be the sharing of resources, as I think that is already true for the East Med Forum. It is an example of integration, and integration. It's beyond also just sharing the gas resources, but as you mentioned, there is infrastructure dimension, regulation dimension, technology dimension that is all included in a common integrated market. Now, one step further would be if you have different levels of resources, your sharing is basically formulated according to complementary nature of what you have. It is not, market integration is not necessarily among countries that have oil, and therefore others are left out, or countries that have gas, and so on. In East Med, the forum started because everybody was interested in cooperating, but that does not really present a general way in which market integration is conceived. Now we have the other angle of that, and that goes to the issue of geopolitics. Now, what we experience in the East Med and some other places, but we're focusing on the East Med, is in fact an unwillingness to find a way of sharing a market. And that is due to the fact that not because some of them have gas and some of them do not have gas, but an unwillingness to enter into a compact, the good word that Hobbes originally used for contract. And that, as you said, is a democratic question because foreign policy is now much more influenced by democratic choices. I have a caveat about that, if I may. And the caveat is that if populist way of seeking votes is considered a democratic choice, then we are in very bad shape. Because, I mean, I'll give a completely different example from the other side of the Atlantic. Make America Great Again project, as we all saw, had the effect basically not only polarizing the United States, but also isolating it from the world.
Yep.
That is,
You want to say something?
Yeah, I would just.
Because we want to open this to questions, so
I
just
forgot
last remark on this.
Just about you asked about the relationship between the LNG and
LNG, yes.
and pipelines. Just one comment, very short comment. You know, pipelines are more or less like a marriage. You know, even worse because you cannot divorce. And so, two countries that are linked with pipelines are linked forever. LNG is a one-night stand, if I may say so. You know, because of course it's driven by financial and pure economic consideration. So when speaking about LNG, it's quite odd. It seems weird, but from a geopolitical point of view, you should pay much more attention on the LNG market, because you know, allies switch, you know, from time to time. So one country which delivers LNG for political reasons could choose to don't do it the day after. With the pipelines, it's much more difficult to do so, because you know everything is so intertwined that you cannot really get rid of the relationship with the Algeria TTPC, the relationship with Libya with the Green Stream, and so on and so on.
Well, LNG provides flexibility, pipeline provides security.
Indeed.
In any case, we'll open that now to questions from the public. So, yes, please.
Hi everyone, thank you for your insights. Igor Malgeri, International Affairs Lead of Edison. I'm not gonna make like personal comments because like being of Edison, like you're gonna, you know, tell me that I'm biased about the, you know, about the project
You
itself.
are.
Yeah, no, of course. So, of course I am. So I would like, you know, like just like to highlight, you know, like your skeptical like approach on the project, but I would like to, you know, go through your comments, you know, like so, like just like to think together about like the reason behind this skepticism. Let me say, for example, like Mr. Hevin highlight us that like there are the economic rationals, okay. Instead, like Ms. Merhab said that there is need of infrastructure and the need for new infrastructure and pipelines for the transportation of hydrogen. And Mr. Balodi highlighted that there are political tension can, you know, endanger the development of these possible pipelines. But before we heard Minister Ferrara talking about only one sea, with no shores, no borders, and like possibility for cooperation. And we know that there is a huge potential in the area. And we said that we were talking about one-night stands and marriages. I mean, and we know that like the partners involved are very reliable partners. I mean, like. Wife material, if we need to talk about marriage. So why, instead of talking about skepticism, why don't we talk about opportunity of cooperation if we're talking about possible like value on the Mediterranean collaboration? Talking about that there is need for security, need for infrastructure, there is the economic reliability. I mean, it's just like. It limits us if we just talk about that no one, like not everyone agrees. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, or shall we take another question and then?
Up to you.
Maybe we take another question, okay? No, another question. Yes. Somebody?
Alexander Politia, I'm the director of the foundation. Just, seizing your last consideration, what would you think is the best mix between security and flexibility? Because on one hand, yes, the Mediterranean is one sea, and we like it or not, we are bound by that sea. On the other hand, we have still a couple of obstacles to be overcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's look at these questions. Again, when I look at the, I know that in some of the cases, and especially after the importance the European Union put on the green energy, many countries in important company like Eni, for example, believe that the future is energy. I also think, and at a certain point, you will remember that Amos Hochstein made his own position well known about the East Mediterranean, but it was basically related to the question of the transition to green energy. Maybe the calculation in the last year and a half or so have changed a little bit, also between that optimum balance between security and flexibility. I also think, you mentioned the fact that countries change, and it is true. We talk about a project of 3, 4, 5 years. But again, in this case, there is the question of reliability. You see that in some countries there is a certain, first of all, of course, the unknown is the unknown, but there are several countries that you have a higher level of reliability that there will be, the project can go on, and others that could be more source of concern. And the question of security and flexibility goes also in that context. But also I think very interesting to try to respond from the, in my opinion, quite pessimistic observation we have made here about these Mediterranean appliances, to respond to the question that were asked here. The fact of the matter is, and I have to say it just before I give you the floor, of course, is that definitely people, countries, also some political forces believe that actually the East Mediterranean pipeline is something that we should continue to pursue, and that it offers also possibility to overcome some of the difficulties and challenges. And in a way, the challenges, some of the geopolitical challenges that were mentioned here, Cyprus, and the question of, one should ask himself, if this is really important, like really important for the European Union, if somebody said here, if it's the question of whether we'll have a warm winter in 2 years or not, is it absolutely impossible to overcome some of the geopolitical issues that were raised here? Or if it is important enough, and all the members of the European Union are involved in this, and they can offer important incentives and disincentives, can one overcome some of these challenges? Or this is detrimental and we are absolutely impossible to go over them. So this is point for reflection on my, and excuse me for taking the floor for too long. Please, Dr. Evan, please.
Thank you. Well, there are a couple of, or three interrelated aspects to this. One is, as you mentioned, optimism versus skepticism. Let me try to clear that. I mean, skepticism, I think, is important. It's the basis of scientific thought. It's not cynicism. But to be under these circumstances, to be very optimistic, reminds me of Candide. That is not the way to meet the challenges that we are facing. Now, what are the challenges that we are facing? And that is your question about what might we be thinking next year, if the weather is inclement, not like this year, and China's industries come under full steam and they soak up all the LNG from the markets, then, well, especially in democratic circumstances, governments will fall if people cannot get heat, enough heat. But if we, the record is not bad, but you know, it is not sure that we will have enough energy in Europe next year. The factors are beyond control. But also we have a complexity in our analysis of what might happen despite the independent variables that come into this question. And basically we are discussing at the same time two contrasting challenges. How do we go about replacing this missing Russian gas immediately? And on the other hand, how can we look 5 years ahead without veering away from our goal for a goal of decarbonization? So this is, in a way, that the crux of the immediate question is something that has to be tackled by companies and governments. And companies are very important in that. I mean, governments can produce regulations, they can bar certain imports and so on and so forth, but they cannot produce energy. So this is a very important factor that one has to look at the expertise available at getting over this. But the governments are, I think, working quite well for the medium term in terms of making available project monies for the medium term decarbonization project. Mm-hmm. So to come back to your question, I'm not pessimistic, but my skepticism is basically questioning of whether more can be done and whether we have really are searching expertly for all the answers and solutions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Berahab?
Yes, sure. So I would like to start with one observation. So when we look more specifically at North Africa, we notice that there is more integration between individual countries of the region in Europe, for instance, than between them. So like the trade agreements between Morocco and Europe, Tunisia and Europe, and so forth. So this lack of integration is actually a missed opportunity, and strengthening this integration supposes the recognition of mutual interests, but also the willingness to overcome some obstacle that may be opposing some countries of the region. So there is no magical solution, as this country, again, if we look at North Africa, it's very small, but it's extremely diverse between oil and gas exporters, energy importers. So infrastructure, as you mentioned, is a part of the solution, but only one part of the solution. And I highlighted in my presentation some economic drivers that can help strengthen regional integration in the area, namely harmonizing policies and regulations, which I believe are very important because it allows to build trust between countries of the region and also trust to attract the private sector within this sector. Infrastructure, of course, not only pipelines, but also electrical connection. And if we look at the North Africa region, we see that there are more electricity exchanges between Morocco and Spain, for instance, with which it has 2 or 3 electrical interconnection than between countries of North Africa. So this is also another challenge to raise, but there's also the sharing of expertise and know-how in order to strengthen this relationship between these countries. And this will only be available or be possible if there is political will to achieve so, and this falls a little bit outside of my economic area of research. Now, we have talked a lot about hydrocarbons and oil and gas, and rightfully so, because it is very relevant for the region in the short term, but there is also the longer vision for energy transition. And this issue poses the challenge of the pace of energy transition, and should developing countries follow the same pace of energy transition as advanced countries like Europe and so forth. And again, this also depends on the various profiles of countries. So it may be more difficult for oil and gas exporters, and it may require them to make careful calibrations between the hydrocarbon projects they build and then their transition. But it may be a little bit more easier for energy importers that have significant renewable resources like Morocco and also Egypt. And we talked earlier about some projects in green hydrogen, for instance, which is still under development. There is no market yet for green hydrogen, but it's still under development, and wind and solar. So basically, to conclude, with the current economic situation, the economy cannot stop, and we have to make do with the system that we have currently while laying and building the blueprint for a future sustainable and resilient energy sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Delodi.
I have 45 seconds. Well, skeptical. Yeah, I think that we should adopt the following approach. So to adopt the approach to be, let's say, the pessimism of the reason and the optimism of the will. And just to give you an example, I think that what happens now, unfortunately, between Russia and Ukraine could be a trigger for such a project. And speaking about pessimism, the reason, I recall the Blue Stream. The Blue Stream is the pipeline which crosses the Black Sea and carries gas from Ankara to Moscow to Ankara, let's say. No one believed in the Blue Stream. A lot of well-informed people, observers say it's not going to happen. Well, it's there. So, hopefully, we will be safely east-met.
Well, thank you very much for all of you, and a special thank for being concise and in time. I think we have highlighted the very important challenges that exist for those who want to try to create a more integrated market. I think that the question of decarbonization is an important factor in this, especially when it comes to long-term project. And maybe we should finish this session by a special note of optimism and hope, which is related to technology and the ability maybe to make a faster progress on, for example, green hydrogen, that will make pipelines a worthwhile investment, also in the context of decarbonization. 20, 25, 30 years ago, we thought that in our region, the next war will be on water. Now, we no longer have a water problem because we can provide 80% of our need from desalination. And it became a source of cooperation between Israel and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates, in Israel, in Palestine, etc. So what if we can make a similar thing to overcome some of the geopolitical and economical difficulties and remain hopeful that both the political context will change positively, and the technological and innovation will provide us with some solution that will help this politics to work for us. So thank you very much, all of you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Pleasure.
Ti vedo meglio.
Grazie.
That's fine.
Well, I think we had a very good panel. I have to digest all the thoughts that have been that have been expressed. I think I will reflect for many more hours probably on all that. I think we arrived at the end of this day, and I am so happy to see, because we know how this conference go. Usually at the end, very few people stay, but the fact that it has been very interesting is shown by the number of people here in the room. So I give the floor to Dr. Rapisarda, who is the responsible at ENI for global security. And of course, there is nobody can be closer to me than somebody in charge of global security, because this is exactly what the foundation is meant for. So, Mr. Rapisarda, you have the floor.
So, good evening. I know I have a very bad role, being a big firewall between you and overcooked pasta. So, provided that we hate overcooked pasta, I try to be brief, but I have a hard job on summarizing what has been said this afternoon in such a terrific event where so many items, so many topics were discussed, and for which I think, and this maybe could be an idea for the foundation, we should organize a specific workshop for each of this. As Mr. President Minuto Rizzo anticipated, I will start specifying my thoughts about global security by telling you my experience when I joined ENI more than 20 years ago in the security department, so dealing with people protection and asset protection. We were seen as a small team, let's say like a private company police department. People didn't understand what we did, what we were doing. They were keeping us away, spying, controlling us. Then we had bad periods over the year 2000 to 2005, 6, 7, 8, 10. Terrorist attacks, kidnappings, criminal activities threatening us, threatening our people and the world everywhere, so that the approach changed, passing from a police department into a service provider. We provide bodyguards, we provide cameras, we provide fences, HESCO bastions where needed, but we were seen as a service provider. Now I can tell you, after so many years of experience, and thanks to the commitment of our top management, of course, we are now a business partner. Security is a business partner. That means that we do not chase, we not follow far away from the business going very fast. We try to be close to them and beside to them, in which security, of course, has the big commitment on protecting people, on protecting assets, and managing risks in the proper way, because it's foreseen by laws, it's foreseen by ethical and responsible business we deal with, but at the same time we are partner into the partnership with institutions, with authorities, with international partners, peers, in granting what is the energy security. A small piece of energy security, supply of energy, is also thanks of the protection of pipeline infrastructures and of course people. but provided that we cannot do it alone, we do it through the authorities, through our local partners and authorities, of course, more and more this activity becomes an activity of good relationship, diplomacy, in which, sorry for that, Ambassador, we do a security diplomacy, which is not the best one. I understand, I'm fully aware of my responsibility, but at the same time, it works. I can tell you it works. So I have to summarize. I have written few notes, and sorry for forgetting maybe some points that were mentioned. And first of all, I will say that Eni as an energy company is always positive, has to be positive, otherwise we were not justified to invest $1 anymore. So thank you at the beginning by bringing Eni's thanks and my personal thanks to NATO Defense College Foundation and to its president, Alessandro Minuto Rizzo, for having organized such an interesting debate on the Mediterranean and its implication on the challenges posed both by a fast-changing scenario, as we have seen even just before, and the necessary steps to be taken in order to implement the lesson learned from both the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis. But from our point of view, the energy sector is suffering for a long time. It's not only about pandemic, it's not only about the war, but it's a long history. Thanks also to the speaker, the prominent speaker that attended the different panels for all the interesting interventions. And they gave us interesting points of view and ideas to think about the future. And I would like to underline that the future has to be pragmatic. So not talking about acting. This is our way to deal in a proactive manner for our future and the future of our children. So we were talking about Mediterranean that could be understood as the liquid continent. It's between three different continents, but it's like a continent itself, in which there are subdivisions and political actors from many different areas. But if we look at the history of our sea, we see and we understand that it's between lands, between territories that have been also named differently in the history, Mare Nostrum by the Romans, but even by us, even if sometimes we say that it belongs to others, Yam Gadul for the Jews, Achdeniz for the Turks, and Big Green for the ancient Egyptians. So the Mediterranean is a space that has changed over the centuries, and if for the ancient Egyptians it represented the border of their territory, facing more towards the Nile and the Red Sea, on the contrary, the Greeks, the Eastern Mediterranean up to Italy was a source of trade and conflict. So still for the Romans, it was the center of the whole empire, which developed along the coastal territories from Europe to North Africa. This great sea, therefore, has always been, since ancient times, the central space of the world, a connecting area, a bridge between different lands, cultures, religions, and languages. This centrality has now become highly topical again. Everyone has spoken about the role of the Mediterranean, which seems to have the solution for all the major issues that we face nowadays: energy, commercial, logistics, and geopolitics that pass on the seabed and on the surface of the sea, and detail not to be forgotten, even in the depth of our seas. The attention to energy developments in the East Med, the energy supply and the migration emergency from North Africa, and the increasingly assertive role of various regional and global players confirm this quadrant of extreme priority for NATO and for the stability of the enlarged Mediterranean. Energy plays a leading role, as demonstrated by the most recent offshore discoveries, such as Zohr, has been mentioned, in Egypt, and the Cyprus offshore, where Eni has played and continues to play a leading role. Essential discoveries that can increase energy security and supply certainty for Europe, and whose development would also represent a fundamental step in the direction of diversification and energy transition. In addition to the developments in the energy sector, those in the field of new technologies also reconfirm the importance of the Mediterranean as the main junction for the underwater infrastructures of the digital networks, crucial components for the protection of national interests. Strategic environments to be protected amid the various evolution that crosses the Mediterranean basin. Europe has the possibility of becoming a leading actor for its neighbors by using the enlarged Mediterranean basin as a multiplier of strategic activities such as digital connection. Cooperation is crucial also in the field of security through a joint mechanism, not only among EU countries, but also in the NATO framework and with the coordination with all the main actors in the Mediterranean for the protection of critical submarine infrastructures, including pipelines, threatened by the activities of potential disruption, as we all know. Among these, the most current, as well as one of the most pressing, are undoubtedly the issue related to the energy markets, as multiple speakers mentioned earlier. It is clear to everyone that the development associated with the Russian invasion have highlighted the lack of a European and also Italian integrated energy strategy, exposing the energy security of individual countries to immediate threats that have been proven difficult to solve. In this context, the cooperation between governments and energy companies has been essential to meet the needs of the European population. In Italy, Eni has been central as a reference entity to replace gas from Russia, with also a strong commitment to end the import of Russian gas by 2025. Also thanks to historical relations with countries like Algeria, Angola, and Congo, and others, thanks to Leonardo Bellodi too, and his job with us in the past, and a robust business strategy over the years that helped us to shape a new scenario for the Italian energy security. In a more general view, to respond to these challenges, it is essential to think a renewed strategy that aims to meet each of the essential pillars of the so-called energy trilemma, achieving environmental sustainability side by side with energy security and economic affordability. As highlighted during the discussion, we must keep in mind that the challenge for the next years is that of having to replace an entire energy framework through a sustainable transition and without thinking that the new structure is risk-free, as people try to underline sometimes. Regardless of this mutation, one certainty will remain, namely the centrality of the Mediterranean and the need to develop an adaptive security approach. And one of the main challenges for the energy sector in the transition process to a low-carbon future is to ensure access to energy for all in an efficient and sustainable way. According to the International Energy Agency projections, in the coming years, energy demand will continue to grow, particularly in emerging markets and developing economies, due to the convergence of several factors, including population increase, increased urbanization, and infrastructure development. The looming threat of climate change and the commitments made by national governments in the Paris Agreement require a strong push forward in the reconversion of industrial processes in specific sectors, such as transport and agriculture, promoting new technologies capable of generating clean energy and creating new job opportunities. Energy transition must therefore be inspired by the principle of the just transition. For example, an energy transition that puts people at the center. That is effective thanks to an incisive approach that adopts the available technologies and that is fair, allowing for the adoption of various solutions at different speeds depending on the specifics of the multiple context and internal constraint. The success of the energy transition will depend, in fact, not only on innovations and investment, but also on how this will manage to be an opportunity for growth and development for people and territories. This will only be possible with the commitment of companies and the institutions to distribute costs equally and implement concrete actions that safeguard the different geographies and multiple actors considering the complexity of the system. Any commitment to any commitment to the transition is related and connected with that of the countries where we are present, with which we are developing innovative initiatives. In some African countries, like Kenya and Congo, for example, we are setting up a network of agri-hubs that will enable us to cover 35% of the supply need of our biorefineries by 2025, while creating jobs and development. We are also working with farmers to reclaim marginal lands, not in competition with the food chain, for example in desert areas, by growing plants for energy use. This is an initiative that will have an impact on employment in the region and will contribute both to Eni's energy transition and that of African countries, promoting their integration into the biofuel value chain with the utmost respect for the environment and human rights. In addition, we promote local development programs with a broad portfolio of community-based initiatives in line with national development plans and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, including supporting the creation of job opportunities and the transfer of know-how and skills to our local partners. Ambassador Ferrara mentioned earlier Enrico Mattei and the strategy that he adopted early in the 50s, so more than 70 years ago, is still valid, is still modern, is still actual, even today for us. So regarding our approach to the discussed topics, the company is pursuing this objective by continuing to develop new gas resources, diversifying geographical presence, leveraging on Eni high-performing exploration, fast-track development approach, improving returns and reducing emissions. To focus on new technology and their development, but to create a diversified energy mix for the energy transition and to support the energy security, continuing to create value while also pursuing breakthrough opportunities. We need to remain agile and innovative, for example, in the development of the satellite model with dedicated entities capable of independently accessing capital markets to fund their growth and reveal the real value of each business, like we did in the case of Plenitude, Sustainable Mobility, Vår Energy, Azul Energy, companies belonging 100% to Eni, together with other partners in the case of Vår Energy and Azul. Last but not least, finally, I would like to emphasize the importance that Eni attaches to the pursuit of sustainable and responsible business, remaining always strongly focused on the protection of people and assets and in all contexts, knowing that the best of our defense strategies is encapsulated in our ability to express our values of dialogue, integration, and partnership with all our stakeholders around the world, our security diplomacy, as I mentioned before. It's, of course, also a matter of closer integration among public and private sector to achieve common prosperity and protection from the possible disruption posed by a rapidly changing scenario now and probably also in the future. The recent geopolitical development demonstrated that a balanced approach that will look not just on the economic convenience helps to build a stable and prosperous system that will resist also to the upcoming changes towards the decarbonization goal in which we strongly believe. Talking about these issues, as we did today, is essential. Acting with consistency, pragmatism, and determination is even more a step towards a sustainable future. So this is my positive message that I wanted to share with you, and thanks to NATO Defense College in the name of Eni. Grazie. Grazie mille.
Well, we are at the end of the day. Grazie a tutti. Thank you very much for being here. Special thanks to moderators and speakers. Some of you have taken the pain to remain more than what they should have done, and I thank them for them. You know, there was an American journalist who told me one day that in Italy there is always the moment of humanity. So this is perhaps the moment of humanity. Buonasera, grazie a tutti.